cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle is simply events that happen during a heartbeat. Because they repeat in a circular pattern, we call it a cycle, cardiac cycle. Within the cardiac cycle, we like to subdivide it into four main categories. Excuse me, four main subparts, if we will. Maybe it's a better word. First of all, we have two main subcategories, and then we have four within those two. Systole is contraction. If it's contracting, then we're in systole. Now, just to make it a little bit slightly more complex, we have atrial contraction, atrial systole, and we have ventricular contraction, systole of the ventricles. Usually, unless we specify, when we're talking about systole, we're talking about the ventricles, because they're the big pumps. The other one, main category, besides systole, is diastole. That is when the heart is resting, relaxing. The heart only gets to rest during diastole. It has to keep beating day and night throughout our whole lives, and it only gets to rest in diastole. So during systole, we have two subphases. We have isovolumetric ventricular contraction, or simply isovolumetric contraction, and we have ventricular ejection. Those two phases, if you see here, are subdivisions of systole. Okay? We also have two subdivisions of diastole. Here we see diastole, and we have ventricular filling and isovolumetric relaxation. Those are our subphases during diastole. We want to look at this pressure volume graph and be able to determine the events of the cardiac cycle, and to be able to determine which phase, systole or diastole, we're in, and which subphase that we're in. When we look at this, we're looking at time going along this direction, our x-axis, and we're looking at a left ventricular volume shown here, and we're looking at primarily a left ventricular pressure. That's this one right here. A left ventricular pressure. There's our aortic pressure as well, and this is our pressure in the atria. So this one is the left ventricular pressure. That's the one that we're most concerned about. And we can correlate the pressure changes with the volume changes in the ventricle. Up here, just for reference, we have the QRS, ECG, the P, QRS, and T waves of the ECG, and we have the heart sounds, which we'll talk about a little later today. So this is our pressure and volume changes. First of all, if we look at the heart, and we'll come back to this graphic, this shows you the pressures and the volumes where they are. This is in the right side, by the way. I added this just so I wanted to show you the heart here when we talk about it. When we're looking at the cardiac cycle, blood is coming into the right and left sides of the heart at the same time. Blood's coming in to the right side, to the right atrium, from the systemic circuit, from the most of the body. It comes in primarily through the superior and inferior vena cava and the cardiac vein carrying blood from the heart itself. And it goes into the right atrium. Then it goes through the tricuspid AV valve into the right ventricle. At the same time, blood is coming into the left atrium from the pulmonary circuit. And then it comes through the 4 pulmonary veins from the lungs into the left atrium, through the mitral valve, and into the left ventricle. The blood on the right side is deoxygenated or less oxygenated because it's coming from the systemic circuit, and the blood in the left side is oxygenated because it's coming back from the lungs, the pulmonary circuit. It's been newly oxygenated. The right ventricle pumps to the lungs through the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary artery, and the left ventricle pumps to the systemic circuit through the aorta. The exiting valves here are the semilunar valves, the pulmonary semilunar valve on the right side, and the aortic semilunar valve on the left side. When we're filling up the heart with blood, we're filling up the ventricles. What happens is, as the blood is returning into the atria, the right and the left, it goes right through the open AV valves and fills up the ventricles about 70%, about 2/3. It fills it up. We call this passive filling because nothing has contracted yet. It's filling it up, filling it up, filling it up, and it gets about 2/3 full. Then the atria contract and they push blood from the atrium into the ventricle, and they fill it up the rest of the way. It's now full. This is going to happen during diastole, when the ventricles are not contracting, and we call it filling, the filling or ventricular filling. When it gets entirely full, that volume when it's entirely full is called the end diastolic volume. The end diastolic volume is a good name. It's the volume of blood in the ventricles at the end of diastole. Okay? After that filling occurs, the ventricles start to contract. As soon as they start to contract, we're in systole. That's the definition of systole. It's the contraction phase. As soon as these ventricles, this muscle here is contracting, it snaps the AV valves shut. They're down into the ventricle. The ventricle starts to contract. They snap shut. They go up like that to prevent the blood from going backwards from the ventricle back into the atrium. There's a very brief time when the semilunar valves, the exiting valves, are still closed. They're still closed. The entry valves, AV, are closed. The exiting valves are closed. So we call this subphase of systole isovolumetric contraction. We know that iso means the same. The same what? The same volume. There's no blood coming in, and there's no blood going out. And the muscle is contracting. What is that going to do to the pressure inside of the ventricle? If the volume is the same and the muscle is contracting, what's happening to the pressure? It's going to go way up, right? We want it to go way up. It makes a little head of steam, right? After that little bit, while the heart ventricle muscle is still contracting, it's still in systole, and you've built up that pressure. You open the exiting semilunar valves. Now blood rushes out of the ventricle. From the left side, it's going into the aorta. On the right side, it's going to the pulmonary trunk. This is the ejection phase. We're in systole, and we're in the ejection phase. After a while, that semilunar valve closes, and there is a brief time before the AV valve opens again, letting more blood in. As soon as the ventricle stops contracting, we're no longer in systole, we're in diastole. As soon as that happens, that valve shuts. The exiting valve, the semilunar valve shuts. We're in diastole, but we're in isovolumetric relaxation. No longer contracting. It's isovolumetric because no blood is coming in, no blood is going out. But now the pressure is going down. So we call it isovolumetric relaxation. And then we start the cycle over again. So we visualize it with that, but then we can graph it out. Notice the events just looking at the volume. And this is a circle that keeps going around. It's a cycle. So here, the volume is nearly full. Right here, by the way, the atria contracts and it fills it up the rest of the way. If we look right here at the volume, without looking at the bottom here, just by looking at the volume and the pressure, can you tell me which phase and subphase we're in? What's happening with the volume from here to here? Going up, going down, or staying the same? Staying the same. So we have to be in one of two phases, right? We have to be either in isovolumetric contraction or isovolumetric relaxation. Fair enough? Okay, we know that because the volume's the same. Now all we have to do is look at the pressure in the ventricle. It's this one here. What's happening from here to here? It's going up, right? It's going way up. So if it's going up, we must be in systole, we must be in contraction, and we're in isovolumetric contraction there. We can tell that just by looking at the volume and the pressure. Okay, now here, the pressure is still going up, correct? From here, up, up, up. But now what's happening with the volume? Going down. That means it's leaving the ventricle. Now if the pressure's going up, we're still in systole. But the volume's going out, so we're in ejection phase. What must have happened right here? We must have opened the semilunar valves. We must have opened, if we're on the left side, the aortic semilunar valve, right? Now, volume is leaving. Pressure's still going up. Notice if we look down here, we're in systole and we are in ventricular ejection. We can check ourselves. It's down here, right? If we want. And there it is. It's going down. Now here, what happened? Well, at this point, the pressure's starting to go down. We're out of contraction. We're in diastole, right here. The exiting valve closed. How do we know? Well, because right in here we have the same volume. So we're in isovolumetric contraction or relaxation. Well, the pressure is, look at it, it's going way down. So we're in isovolumetric relaxation. And of course that's diastole, it's no contraction, so it's in diastole. Then right here, what happens? We open the AV valves, the entry valves. If we're on the left side, the mitral valve. We're still at low pressure, we're in diastole, but look what's happening. The ventricle's filling. This is the same here as over here. So it fills, and then right there, the atria contracts, fills it up the last 30%, and then we're going through the cycling. So simply by looking at this graph and knowing the changes in volume correlated to the changes in pressure, we can tell if we're in systole and diastole, and we can tell which subphase we're in, and we can tell which valves are open and which valves are closed. Are they both closed? We're in an isovolumetric phase, either isovolumetric contraction or isovolumetric relaxation. If blood is leaving, then the semilunar valves are open, and the AV valves are closed, prevent it from going back. If we're filling the ventricle, the AV valves are open, semilunar valves are closed. Not too bad, right? It's good, we play around with it a little bit, you know, you'll go through it, you know, mess around with it. But that gives us the changes that we see, so we can see all of that. This shows it on the right side, which is a low pressure system. So, I put it here again, simply without the labels, just with the time. So you can practice on this without having the labels down here to distract you. And you can go through it. So wherever we put it, you can tell, you know, is this systole or diastole? Is it, which subphase is it? And that helps us visualize it. Now, when we look at the heart in this way, we said when it fills with blood, that's the end diastolic volume, because that's the end of diastole. It's been filling, now it's full. Now it's ready to contract. Okay, we call that the end diastolic volume, because it's the end of diastole, and that's when the ventricle chamber is full. Now when we empty it, flip the lights back on and off. If we empty it, so we start contraction, first we have isovolumetric contraction, and then we open the exiting semilunar valves, mitral here, and we contract and we have ejection. We don't inject the entire volume of the ventricle during a beat. We inject maybe about 2/3 of it. The part that we eject from the heart and goes out to the blood vessels is called the stroke volume. The part that's left in after you push the blood out, about 2/3 of it out, that's called the end systolic. It's the end of the contraction. End systolic volume. If we look at our graph, our end diastolic volume is right there. That's when it's full. This is the stroke volume, the volume between here and here. And this is our end systolic volume. This volume went out, exited the heart. This is what's still left in. Okay? So we can make an equation the end diastolic volume equals the stroke volume plus second. But if we know two of those things, we can algebraically rearrange it. So if we want to know the stroke volume, we would simply subtract the end systolic volume from both sides. And we would have the stroke volume. Is that all right? If we want to visualize that, I like to visualize things. If this is the ventricle and this is our end diastolic volume, the stroke volume is the part that goes out. The part that stays is the end systolic volume. So the end diastolic volume is when it's full, then it gets pumped out during ejection, but not all of it is pumped out. We still have some. That's the end systolic volume. This is the stroke volume. You can see that the stroke volume and the end systolic volume added up equals the end diastolic volume, right? So it's not that hard. And so we can rearrange that equation whichever way we want if we know two of the variables.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I have kind of a random question, but I was just thinking about it, like anatomy-wise. So say somebody is born, instead of a tricuspid aortic valve, they have a bicuspid. Like, how does that impact this, basically, like, scenario? I'm just curious, because I know people can live with it for a long time.
What you're describing, I think, is what if they have a leaky valve?
Possibly, yeah. Maybe just like a malformation.
So, there's a couple, I'm gonna talk about this in just a little bit, so can we hold it off a little bit? Because that's a very good question. What happens if your valves are either leaky or if they're stenotic, too narrow? What happens, okay? So we'll get to that in just a minute, because that's important question too. And we're almost there, because we have some normal heart sounds. If you listen to the heart, it makes what we describe it, somebody described it as love dub, love dub, love dub, love dub. The love is the first heart sound, the dub is the second. The love, or the first heart sound, is produced by the closing of the AV valves during isovolumetric contraction. Right here. They close, it's contracting, so the AV valve, there's the first heart sound. See that right there? Right there, that's the love. The dub is produced by the closing of the semilunar valves. There it is. They close, and you're going into your isovolumetric relaxation. Right there. That's the love dub. Now let's get to your point. An abnormal heart sound is a heart murmur. So love dub is normal. If we hear something else, we say, okay, you've got a heart murmur. What causes a heart murmur? Well, there's a number of things that can cause it, but the most common things that cause an abnormal heart sound, is if your valves, one of them or more, either leak or are stenotic, too narrow. This could happen if you're born with it that way, or it could happen with damage. Some people, they get rheumatic fever when they're young, and later on their antibodies attack their valves, and it can damage it and cause it to not work correctly. Sometimes as we age, the valve wears out a bit or becomes less. Now, if the problem gets really bad, you have to replace the valve. They used to use PICC valves. Most of they use artificial valves now. They've improved the artificial valves quite a bit. So you can you can do that, but you know, you have to go in there, the heart, open renal surgery, and take. A lot of people, if it's not too deleterious of an effect, they'll live with it. But if it slowly gets worse, they say, okay, we gotta go in there and replace the valve. Okay. So, if we're going to do it, we can have either heart stenosis, that means it gets too narrow. A lot of times it gets calcified and it gets too narrow. If it's too narrow, if it's stenotic, when it's open, the blood doesn't go through as efficiently as it should. It's like a valve in a pipe it's clogged up a bit. It doesn't let this fluid, in this case blood, go through very efficiently. That's stenotic valve. If it's a leaky valve, sometimes we use the name insufficient. That just means it's leaky. That means when it's closed, it's leaking some fluid back through it. We don't want that either. Okay. Now, would you hear, let's say your mitral valve is stenotic, would you hear this abnormal heart sound, murmur, during systole or diastole? So I've heard both. Should we vote? It's not quite November or whatever it is, 6th or whatever. This is a think it through, right? We love this in physiology, right? Think it through. Well, we sort of given the way to get there, right? If this is stenotic and it's the AV valve, like the mitral valve, then it's going to be a problem when it's open. When is it open? It's open during diastole, when it's filling. It's closed during systole. So this is going to happen during diastole. Did we convince you of that? Still thinking about it? Okay, that's what's going to happen. Now, what if it's your semilunar valve? What if it's your aortic valve and it's stenotic? Well, it is open during systole, specifically during the ejection phase of systole. So that's when you're going to hear the murmur, when blood is being forced through it, but not as efficiently. It's going to make a sound, a turbulent sound, right? It's not going to be nice, smooth flowing. It's going to be a turbulent sound. Okay? Now, what about if it's a leaky valve? It's going to be the opposite. If it's your mitral valve, it's supposed to be closed during systole, but it's supposed to be open during diastole. So, when is the leakiness going to be a problem? When it's closed. It's not supposed to let blood flow back through it when it's closed. So we would hear the murmur during systole if it's the mitral valve. If it's the semilunar valve, we would hear it during diastole. It's supposed to be closed during filling. So that's where you would get these problems with the valves. And they could cause these kinds of issues. Because any of these could cause a less efficient movement of blood, you could be not moving your blood as well, not getting oxygen to the cells as well, and you could be getting a problem. And if it's not too bad, they might live with it. They may only feel it like when they're really strongly exercising, or they might live with it and then all of a sudden they, oh, I can't, it's not doing it, and then they gotta, let's go repair it, let's go. Usually, you could sometimes repair it, a lot of times they just replace it.
Since both stenotic valves and leaky valves result in diminished blood flow, would that mean that the heart would have to work harder in both cases?
Would have to work harder. And you can see why. If there's a leaky valve, so let's say the mitral valve is leaky, some of the blood is actually leaking back from the ventricle backwards through the atrium. And so that's going to affect your stroke volume. And you have to repump the blood the next. And the same if it's stenotic, you have to push harder to get it through. And so then your cardiac output is affected, entire output. And then you're not delivering oxygen, not only to every place else, but to the heart. So it has to work harder. That's exactly right. So those are some of the issues that we can get. Now, cardiac output, I just mentioned that name. Cardiac output, how is that different from stroke volume? Stroke volume is the output, the volume for one beat. Cardiac output is the output of blood from the ventricle per minute. So we can easily make an equation for cardiac output. Cardiac output simply is equal to our heart rate times our stroke volume. The stroke volume is the volume that goes out per beat, and the heart rate is how many beats you have per minute. We can see right away that the cardiac output is not fixed. Our resting cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute. Our blood volume is about 5 liters. So a resting cardiac output, we move our entire blood through the heart in 1 minute. But if we exercise, especially really strongly, we can get our cardiac output all the way up to 25 liters per minute, about 5 times as much volume per minute. We're moving our entire blood volume through the heart 5 times in a minute. Why do we need that? Because we have to deliver more oxygen and nutrients to our muscles and everything else, because we're utilizing it. We're running as fast as we can, or swimming, whatever. We're exercising. So that's our cardiac output. So it's written there. I'll just write it here too. It's just like cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. This is a volume. It could be in milliliters or liters. Milliliters per beat, right? 4 liters. Heart rate is in beats per minute. And cardiac output is your volume. We could say milliliters or liters per minute. So the beats would cancel when we're multiplying those. And that's how we're getting our. I don't know if I like orange. Too in your face. Can you see that all right, or is that too hard? Okay, so that's what this is right here, right? Now, cardiac output is very important. We have to maintain our cardiac output, but we can vary it. How do we vary our cardiac output? Well, we can either change the heart rate or we can change the stroke volume. If we increase our heart rate, we're going to increase our cardiac output as long as our stroke volume stays the same or goes up, right? How do we increase our heart rate? Sympathetic. Norepinephrine or epinephrine, we increase our heart rate. Our heart rate goes up right away when we're exercising, right? Makes our cardiac output go up. How do we decrease our heart rate after we've been exercising? Parasympathetic, vagus, acetylcholine. That's what this right here is showing us, right? That's the negative, that's going down. This increases, this goes down. Well, what about our stroke volume? Our stroke volume we can increase. How do we do that? Well, The stroke volume can be increased if you stretch the myocardial fibers a little more than what they're accustomed to. If you stretch them a little bit, they'll contract with greater vigor or force. What do we call that relationship, by the way? Starling's law of the heart, right? You saw it in the video, the turtle. That's Starling's law of the heart. Starling's law of the heart is if you increase, in this case, your end diastolic volume, you're making it more full, you're stretching it more, you can stretch the fibers more, and they will contract with greater vigor. You can also increase the stroke volume with your sympathetic nerves, and norepinephrine and epinephrine, because that increases the contractility, forces it, boom, and that can increase your stroke volume. When we exercise, we increase the stroke volume, we increase the heart rate, and we increase the cardiac output, up to 5 times as much with those mechanisms. Now, what could decrease the stroke volume? Well, you have to take in afterload. Preload is the end diastolic volume. Afterload is what it's pushing out against. It's pushing out against our blood pressure in our veins, like our aorta, for instance. We have to have a pressure because it's got to circulate the blood around. But if that pressure gets too high, you increase the resistance, and it's harder for the heart, the ventricle, to push that same volume of blood out. We've increased the afterload right there if we increase our mean arterial pressure. And the heart has to work harder every beat to push out the same volume of stroke volume. This is why hypertension, one of the reasons, it's so hard on the heart. If you have a resting high blood pressure, higher than normal, then every beat we've got to try to force the same volume of blood out against a greater resistance, a greater afterload. It wears out the heart over time. It's okay to have it higher for a while when you're exercising, but if it's higher every single beat when you're awake, when you're asleep all the time, after a while the heart says, I can't do this anymore, I'm so tired. So that's the problem. One last think it through here. Does a really in-shape athlete tend to have a higher or lower resting heart rate than the normal overall population? Lower. This equation helps us understand that. Somebody who exercises their heart routinely and makes it work, makes their heart stronger. That means when it's resting, not exercising, it's real strong. It can go boom, 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 and it can put out a big stroke volume. So it doesn't need as many heartbeats. You can lower your heart rate if your heart is very strong and it puts out a high stroke volume, and it'll maintain your cardiac output. This one goes up, that one's allowed to go down, so this one. So you're resting your heart more because you don't have to have it beat as much. And that's why it's healthy for an athlete to have a lower heart rate. Now, it's no good to have bradycardia if you're not an athlete, because then maybe something's wrong. But if you have a strong heart, you might probably have a lower resting heart rate than most people. It means you're in really good shape. That's a good thing, right? And that helps us understand why that's the case. Here's some equations. We've looked at this, cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. This is one rearrangement of that equation we put on the board.
stroke volume equals end diastolic minus stroke, end systolic volume. Here's mean arterial pressure, cardiac output times total peripheral resistance, or we can use this one, mean arterial pressure equals 1/3 of this relationship. This is the systolic blood pressure minus the diastolic, plus the diastolic blood pressure. I give you these in part because we might have them on the test, but also in part because some of this is in your cardiac case studies. So just to let you know. We'll say more about this one when we get to blood pressure, these last two. But these two I think you feel pretty comfy with now. Now, calculating cardiac output can be a little bit tricky because it's hard. We can easily calculate the heart rate. That's no problem. But to calculate the stroke volume is challenging. And so we can use this equation. Cardiac output equals the oxygen consumption. You have to measure. You put somebody in a little box and you're measuring their oxygen consumption, divided by, you take a blood sample of the arterial blood and the venous blood, so you have your arterial minus venous oxygen content. And you can find it in that way. This is calculating it. We gave you some numbers here. Here's plugging the numbers in. And we get about 5,000 milliliters per minute or 5 liters per minute. You can also use volumes for oxygen content. This shows it using volumes. So you can calculate it doing that. This is a ventricular function curve. We have the end diastolic volume on the x-axis. This could also be the cardiac output. It would be, over here it could be the cardiac output. If you increase your end diastolic volume, based on this slope of the line, you could increase your stroke volume, which could increase your cardiac output. Say it again, because I sort of messed that up a little bit. On the x-axis, we have end diastolic volume. There it is. On the y-axis, we have stroke volume. This same relationship would work if we substituted cardiac output here for stroke volume. We have a relationship. If you increase the end diastolic volume, you'll increase the stroke volume. You'll increase the cardiac output. This relationship is basically telling us Starling's law of the heart. If you increase the end diastolic volume, you can increase your stroke volume, you can increase your cardiac output. And it's along this slope. This is a normal resting value, but you can increase it if you need to. Increase in diastolic volume, according to Starling's law of the heart, increases your stroke volume and your cardiac output. If you have a normal slope, same relationship, in diastolic volume, stroke volume, or cardiac output. If you add, let's say this is your normal slope of the line, with Frank Starling's law. If you add sympathetic stimulation, you can move to a different slope of the line. Starling's law is still in effect, but now you are, for every end diastolic volume, you have a greater stroke volume or cardiac output. You're on a different slope of the line. You can shift from one slope to another. This slope is giving us the Frank Starling law effect. But if you add, in addition to that, the sympathetic effect, you can jump to a different slope. You feel okay about that? If we put a certain end diastolic volume, if we look at that slope, and that slope, and that slope, you could see we'd have a lower stroke volume with this slope, a higher stroke volume here, and an even higher stroke volume here. We have the same end diastolic volume. What's changed? We're adding sympathetic stimulation as well. And so we jump to different slopes of the line. And that's what that's indicating for us. This is the same thing. Here we have a normal resting in diastolic volume. If we increase our venous return, we have a greater in diastolic volume. We increase our stroke volume, we increase our cardiac output. Slope of the line here is our normal, controlled. If we add sympathetic stimulation, we jump up to the orange slope. Sympathetic also stimulates contraction of the heart, and so that's why we're jumping from one slope to another. We can increase our end-diastolic volume by increasing our sympathetic norepinephrine from the nerves and epinephrine from the blood. How about the heart? Excuse me, how about the heart rate and the contraction? Our sinoatrial node, we can increase the heart rate with either norepinephrine or epinephrine binding to beta-adrenergic receptors at the sinoatrial node. We can decrease it with parasympathetic acetylcholine binding to muscarinic receptors. How about the AV node? Increase conduction, decrease. How about muscle, increase contractility? The only one, parasympathetic, doesn't have any impact on the ventricular muscle contractility. So that gives us an idea of how we can affect it. This shows it with a flow chart. Epinephrine increasing in diastolic volume according to Starling's law of the heart can increase our stroke volume. Norepinephrine, all those increase stroke volume, increase heart rate. If we have parasympathetic and we decrease the others, well, this is a decrease in parasympathetic, so that will increase the heart rate. If we reverse this, it would make the heart rate go lower. We still okay? Didn't lose you there, all that. Okay, so Friday, we're gonna go over coronary blood flow to the heart itself, and some of the things we can get into, congestive heart failure and some of the other problems, myocardial infarctions and all that. And then we're gonna do, we're gonna start on the vasculature, the blood vessels, and we're gonna look at regular blood pressure, hypertension, things like that. And we're gonna do that Friday and probably about half of Monday, and then we're gonna start on respiratory